1976. The American F-15 Eagle takes to the skies. The United States believes it owns the heavens. But in Moscow, through steel frost and the roaring tunnels of Tsagii, a different story was being written. A machine not just to challenge the Eagle, but to overturn the balance of power. This is the birth of the Sukhoi Su-27. The Cold War was more than politics. It was a race for survival where the first strike could end the world in minutes. Strategic bombers carried nuclear fire across oceans, but bombers were slow and vulnerable. To protect them, and to stop the enemy's bombers, both sides needed fighters. Fighters that could fly far, fight hard, and win the skies. Air superiority wasn't just a mission, it was survival. If America's bombers got through Moscow, would burn. If Soviet bombers got through Washington, would vanish. The only shield was the fighter.
Red alert.
The Soviets demanded more than speed. They needed endurance. A fighter must fly hundreds of miles to meet a bomber, head-on loiter in patrol, and still have fuel to dogfight. It had to climb to stratospheric altitudes, match Mach 2, and strike hard with missiles and cannon fire. And it had to do all this from rough frozen runways across the vast Soviet Union. Range, bomber escort, long cap, 295 to 160. Mach 2 plus Aslan, intercept, B-52, B-1. Heavy firepower, defeat escorts, ensure kill. Short, rough runways. Soviet geography dispersed bases. By 1969, the Kremlin learned of a new American project, the FX program. The result would become the F-15 Eagle, a machine designed from the ground up to dominate every air battle, light enough to dogfight, heavy enough to strike. With radar so powerful, it could see beyond the horizon. If the F-15 flew unchallenged, the Soviet Union would lose the skies before the fight even began. The answer was the PFI project, Perspektivny Frontovoy Istrebitel, the advanced tactical fighter. But ambition was too great. So the Soviets split the dream in two heavy fighter TPFI assigned to Sukhoi, lightweight fighter LPFI assigned to Mikoyan. Two paths, two machines, two chances to save the motherland. The heavy fighter's mission read like an impossible equation range to escort nuclear bombers, speed to catch American intruders, agility to dogfight F-15s, firepower to guarantee the kill, and ruggedness to survive on broken icy airstrips. Most aircraft in history could do one or two. The Soviets demanded them all.
Both.
Range versus agility. Opposite demands. Interceptor versus dogfighter, chasseurs, different airframes. One aircraft must be both. To the engineers, it was a nightmare. But to the generals, it was non-negotiable. The Soviet Union would not surrender the sky. Behind the demands was fear. One miscalculation could unleash nuclear Armageddon. If the United States gained air superiority, Soviet bombers could be destroyed on the ground. If the Soviets failed to intercept America's B-52s and B-1s, could strike Moscow before sunrise. The balance of terror rested on wings. And so Sukhoi's team picked up their pencils and began the hardest race of their lives. They would design the Soviet Union's answer to the Eagle. They would design the Su-27. But first, they would fail. Again and again. The race to answer the Eagle began with the T-10 prototype. It looked sleek on paper twin tails, wide wings, powerful engines, but in reality, it was a beast they could not yet control. On May 20th, 1977, the first T-10 took flight. For a moment, hope filled the skies over Moscow. But engineers soon realized the aircraft was dangerously unstable. Its aerodynamics fought the pilot. Its heavy electronics lagged behind Western systems, and its engines guzzled fuel at a terrifying rate. The second prototype, T-10-2, flew in May 1978. Less than 2 months later, on July 7th, disaster struck. Overloaded by G-forces, its structure failed. The aircraft broke apart, another dream in pieces. The flaws were everywhere. Aerodynamics made the jet twitch and stall. Electronics were too heavy, too primitive compared to America's F-15. Engines burned fuel faster than they could calculate. And worst of all, the Soviets had no accurate data on the Eagle. They were fighting blind. By the late 1970s, failure piled upon failure. The Americans already had the F-15 in service. Sukhoi had only wreckage. Chief designer Mikhail Simonov made a brutal decision to tear it all down, start again from scratch. He later recalled, "We kept just the tires in the pilot's seat." The redesigned prototype was called the T-10S.
I think you're right.
Engineers reshaped the wings, streamlined the fuselage, and added a fly-by-wire system to tame its instability. At last, the flanker was beginning to take form. But progress still came at a price. The first T-10S flew on April 20th, 1981. By September, it had crashed. The second prototype followed in December, and it too was lost. Each flight test was a gamble with lives, with the program itself hanging by a thread. Finally, in May 1982, after years of redesign and heartbreak, the 17th prototype, T-1017, took to the skies. It flew stable, it flew strong. For the first time, Sukhoi had a fighter worthy of the mission. From broken wrecks and shattered hopes, the flanker rose again. It was still years away from service, but the foundation was finally solid. The Soviets had bled for this aircraft, and soon the world would see what that sacrifice had created. By the early 1980s, the flanker finally stood on solid wings. A new design philosophy gave it life, the integral wing body. Unlike the boxy shapes of older jets, the Su-27 blended wing and fuselage into one flowing surface. This gave massive lift, superb stability at low speeds, and room for enormous fuel tanks. With fly-by-wire controls constantly correcting its flight, the flanker could hold angles of attack no pilot could have managed alone. It wasn't just stable, it was super maneuverable. Power came from the Saturn AL-31F turbofan. At last, the Soviets had an engine both reliable and ferocious, 27,600 pounds of thrust each with afterburner. Twin engines that could lift the flanker like a rocket and keep it flying across continents. In June 1985, the 1st Regiment, the 801st Fighter Aviation Regiment at Meyerhorod, received its Su-27s. 5 years later, in August 1990, the flanker was officially declared combat ready. What had begun as wreckage was now a frontline guardian of the Soviet sky. But Sukhoi wanted more than service entry.
The data here shows
they wanted to prove to the world that the flanker could outclimb the Eagle. With a stripped-down prototype named P-42, engineers chased the F-15's time-to-altitude records. And one by one, they shattered them, 27 records in all. The Streak Eagle's reign was over. The flanker had arrived. Time-to-altitude records: 3 kilometers here, 25.4s, 6 kilometer, 37.1s, 9 kilometers, 47s, 12 kilometers, 58s, 15 kilometer, 112. Then came Paris, 1989. Test pilot Viktor Pugachev pulled the jet into the unheard-of Cobra maneuver. The flanker pitched its nose past 100 degrees, halted in mid-air, then fell back into flight like a predator bearing its fangs. The crowd gasped. Western pilots whispered this was no ordinary fighter. By the dawn of the 1990s, the Su-27 was no longer a troubled prototype. It was a symbol of Soviet engineering, of resilience of a fighter built to challenge the West at its peak. But its true legacy would be written not just in test flights, but in the battles that followed. To understand the Su-27 not as a symbol but as a weapon, we must translate its numbers into missions. Every line of its specification carried meaning on the battlefield. The flanker was massive, over 21 meters long wings, spanning nearly 15 meters. Its empty weight rivaled some World War II bombers, but inside that huge frame lay its ace, almost 9.4 tons of internal fuel. Enough to fly 3,500 kilometers on a single tank without drop tanks, because the Su-27's base design didn't even have hardpoints for them. This wasn't a fighter meant for a border skirmish. It was built to fly deep, to escort the Tu-95s and Tu-160s carrying nuclear payloads, or to maintain combat air patrols across the vast Arctic skies. At altitude, the Su-27 could reach Mach 235. Its ceiling was 19,000 meters, not 9,000, as sometimes misreported, but still high enough to stalk incoming B-52s to position above a formation before swooping down. Speed and altitude were not just numbers, they were initiative. The flanker could choose when and where to fight. 10 external hardpoints carried its bite. The R-27 medium-range radar or infrared guided formed the backbone. The R-73 short-range high off-bore sight was the knife in close combat. Together they gave the Su-27 both reach and teeth. Where the flanker truly scared Western pilots was its pairing of the R-73 with a helmet-mounted sight. The pilot could simply look at an enemy up to 60 degrees off the nose and fire. No need to point the aircraft first. And with the OLS-27 infrared search and track system, the Su-27 could detect and engage targets without turning on its radar at all. Silent hunting, deadly in close quarters. HMS plus R-73. High off-bore sight shot. 60 degrees, OLS-27 IRST, passive detection, no radar warning for the enemy. For longer reach, the Su-27 carried the N001 pulse Doppler radar. It offered true look-down, shoot-down capability and track while scan, a leap for Soviet avionics. Export models for China received simplified versions, the N001E and later N001P. But the principle was the same: situational awareness and the ability to strike first. Picture this: two Tu-160 bombers surge westward across the Arctic. Their Guardians, Su-27s, stretch their patrols hundreds of kilometers, never needing drop tanks. Or a lone flanker, circling the pole, maintaining combat air patrol, its radar sweeping the empty sky. Or the chaos of a close-in dogfight where a Su-27 pilot simply turns his head, his helmet sight cues the missile, and an R-73 streaks off the rail. Numbers made into reality. This was the flanker's design brought to life. The Su-27 wasn't just another Soviet jet. It was an ecosystem of power long legs, high-speed supermaneuverability, and lethal weapons tied to the pilot's own eyes. But specifications are only promises. The true test would come in combat. Two giants of the fourth generation, the American F-15 Eagle and the Soviet Su-27 flanker, both born of the Cold War's most urgent demand, absolute air superiority. But their strengths were not the same. The Eagle carried America's cutting edge in avionics. Its APG-63 radar and later the APG-70 could track multiple targets beyond visual range. With AIM-7 Sparrows and from the 1990s, AIM-120 AMRAAMs, the F-15 was designed to kill before it ever merged with the enemy, and its combat record showed it over 100 confirmed air-to-air kills without a single loss in dogfight against peer fighters. The flanker answered with a different philosophy. It was super maneuverable, able to hold extreme angles of attack. With the OLS-27 infrared search and track system, it could find targets silently. And when paired with a helmet-mounted sight and the R-73 missile, the Su-27 turned close combat into a nightmare for any opponent. In the turning fight, the flanker had claws the Eagle could not ignore. Beyond visual range, the Eagle held the cards: longer reach, stronger radar, smarter missiles. Within visual range, the tables turned. The flanker's agility, infrared tracking, and helmet-cued weapons made it lethal once the merge happened. Each jet was dominant in its own arena. But air combat is not just numbers on paper. Who had AWACS support? Whose electronic warfare jammed the other's radar? What rules of engagement applied? Did they need visual ID, or could they fire on radar lock alone? And above all, how skilled was the pilot in the cockpit? These questions often mattered more than thrust to weight or missile range. So who would win the fair? Answer: it depends. Beyond visual range, the Eagle's radar and AMRAAM tilted the balance toward the United States. Within visual range, the flanker's agility and R-73 missile gave the Soviets the edge. The truth of victory lay not in specifications, but in context: the presence of AWACS, the strength of electronic countermeasures, the rules of engagement, and the skill of the pilot. On paper, the Eagle and the flanker were equals. In reality, their battles would always be decided by the sky they fought in. The flanker was built for a clash with the F-15, a clash that never came. But history still gave us glimpses of what the Su-27 could and could not do. From Africa to the Arctic, from Syria to Ukraine, the flanker left a trail of case studies that spoke louder than theory. The only real jet vs jet kill record for the Su-27 came not over Europe, but Africa. In 1999 and 2000, Ethiopia's Su-27s faced Eritrea's MiG-29s in the skies above the Horn of Africa. 4 MiG-29s were shot down. 0 flankers were lost. The reasons: better situational awareness from ground radar integration, better training of Ethiopian pilots supported by Russian advisors, and the Su-27's own advantages: longer legs, stronger energy in the merge, and the R-73 missile with helmet cueing. It was textbook proof that in a real knife fight, the flanker could dominate its Soviet stablemate. 2 years after entering service, the Su-27 nearly sparked an international crisis. On September 13, 1987, over the Barents Sea, a Soviet flanker intercepted a Norwegian P-3 Orion. But the intercept came too close. The Su-27's wing clipped the Orion's propeller. Miraculously, both aircraft landed safely. The incident highlighted not combat prowess, but the razor-edge risk of Cold War encounters where one miscalculation could mean escalation. Fast forward to 2015. In Syria, the Su-27 SM-3 returned to the front line, not as a dogfighter, but as a guardian, flying combat air patrols, escorting bombers, and signaling to NATO aircraft that Russia still held sharp teeth. Here, the flanker was less about kills and more about presence. A flying flag of deterrence, its role was psychological as much as tactical. But the flanker's greatest trial came in Ukraine. In 2014, as Russia annexed Crimea, Ukrainian Su-27s were pulled from storage and rushed into service. Yet the true test arrived in 2022 when Russia launched its full-scale invasion. Both sides fielded the flanker. Both sides suffered. Ukraine's Su-27s faced layered Russian air defenses, long-range surface-to-air missiles, and newer fighters like the Su-35. Several were shot down by SAMs by R-77 missiles and sometimes destroyed on the ground. Russia too lost Su-27s, though, at a slower rate. The lesson: in the 21st century, survivability is no longer just about agility or thrust. It's about network sensors and standoff weapons. The Su-27, a marvel of the 1980s, struggled against the digital battlefield of the 2020s. 1987, Barents Sea incident risk of escalation. 1999-2000, Ethiopia versus Eritrea, Su-27 combat kills. 2015, Syria capped deterrence role. 2022, Ukraine war losses under modern air defenses. From near collisions in the Arctic to kills in Africa, to patrols over Syria, to heavy losses in Ukraine, the flanker's story in combat is a patchwork. At times triumphant, at times tragic, and in the modern era, often outmatched by the very evolution of air warfare it once defined. Yet through it all, the Su-27 remains one of the few Soviet aircraft to boast confirmed kills against peer adversaries and a lasting reputation as the jet that could stare the eagle in the eye. But the flanker's story is not just triumphs and legends, it carries shadows too. July 27, 2002, Snyliev Airfield, Ukraine. A Su-27UB, performing a tight maneuver at an air show, loses control. It crashes directly into the crowd. 77 people are killed, including children. Over 500 are injured. It remains the deadliest air show accident in history. For the Su-27, the tragedy shattered the myth of invulnerability. This was no untouchable beast. It was a machine bound by training safety margins and human error. The lesson is clear: no fighter, no matter how advanced, is immune to tragedy. Every Su-27 sortie depends not just on design, but on pilots' procedures and the discipline of those who operate it. The flanker could dazzle on the edge of physics, but only if handled with care. Yet even as the original flanker aged, its DNA lived on. The Su-27 became more than a fighter, it became a family. A whole ecosystem of aircraft, each adapting the core design for new missions, new decades, and new nations. The Su-30, a two-seat, multi-role fighter. With a weapons systems officer in the back seat, it expanded the flanker's reach, striking ground and naval targets, while still holding air superiority. India, Algeria, and dozens more nations would adopt it as their cornerstone jet. The Su-33, reborn for the sea. With folding wings, canards, and a tailhook, it turned the flanker into a carrier-capable fighter. Russia's answer to the American Tomcat, though limited by the troubled Kuznetsov carrier itself. The Su-35, a flanker in body, but nearly 5th gen in spirit. With thrust vectoring engines, digital avionics, and radar to rival the West, it became Russia's premier fighter of the 21st century, bridging the gap until the Su-57. The Su-34 proof of flanker versatility. With a side-by-side cockpit and reinforced airframe, it evolved into a strike aircraft, carrying heavy bombs and cruise missiles, flying deep into contested airspace. The Su-47 Berkut, the bold experiment, swept forward wings, exotic composites, and futuristic lines. It never became operational, but it proved what the flanker's DNA could stretch into. Beyond Russia, China built its own chapter. Starting with 76 imported Su-27SK and UBK models, the Shenyang J11 was born. Licensed at first, then localized, then upgraded with Chinese avionics and missiles. By the hundreds, J-11s filled the PLA Air Force proof, that the flanker's bones could anchor another superpower's rise. In the end, the Su-27 was never just one fighter. It was a framework, a skeleton strong enough to carry dozens of missions, generations, and national doctrines. From the frozen decks of Russian carriers to the deserts of India, from the skies of Africa to the factories of Shenyang, the flanker family remains one of the most influential lineages in aviation history. The Su-27 was born to face one enemy, the F-15 Eagle, and in many ways, it succeeded on paper in the aerobatic arena and in the rare snapshots of combat. But perhaps its greatest legacy is not in kill counts or records broken. It lies in the simple fact that both Titans, the Eagle and the flanker, shared the skies for decades. And through all the tension, the close calls, the brinkmanship, the world never slipped into World War III. The flanker gave the Soviet Union an answer to the Eagle. It gave Russia a flagship for decades. It inspired a family of aircraft that continues to fly today. And it reminded the world that even in rivalry, there can be balance. In the end, the Su-27 was more than a jet. It was a symbol of a race that stayed cold, a duel of engineering and willpower, not of mushroom clouds. And maybe that is the greatest victory of all. Su-27 Flanker, the jet that faced the Eagle and helped keep the Cold War cold.